Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
In the summer of 2016, amid the scorching heat and absolute silence of Death Valley National Park, 4 young friends suddenly vanished as if they had never existed. Lily Carter, Ethan Cole, Marcus Reed, and Ava Bennett had only intended to veer off the familiar trail for a few hours to explore a remote area they believed was harmless, a decision that seemed so small but ended up erasing every trace of them from the world. There were no distress calls, no signs of struggle, no clues at all, except for one final cryptic text message. They had found something that shouldn't exist there. After that moment, they all disappeared. Phones turned off, signals lost, and the 4 people seemingly swallowed by the barren desert itself. For 7 years, their families lived in cruel waiting, torn between hope and despair, forced to believe the worst, that nature had quietly ended them without leaving a trace. But then, a chance discovery in an area that had never been searched changed everything. An old device, buried deep under layers of rock and sand, was pulled into the light, and inside it was something no one was prepared to face. New photos. Familiar faces. They were still alive, but no longer the humans they once were. Their bodies emaciated, eyes empty, locked in a sealed space with no light, and on their skin were numbers carved with chilling precision, as if someone was not only holding them captive, but monitoring, classifying, and controlling every moment of their existence. In the summer of 2016, the sun poured fire onto the scorched rock formations and the endless stretches of dry sand in Death Valley National Park, where even the wind carried a scorching heat and every trace of human presence seemed to be swallowed up within just a few hours. In that harsh landscape, 4 close friends, Ethan Cole, Ava Bennett, Ryan Cruz, and Lily Harper, began a road trip they believed would be just like the previous ones, free, exploratory, and without limits. Ethan was the practical one, always planning and keeping everything under control. Maya was passionate about photography, always drawn to unusual details that others might overlook. Ryan loved adventure and was often the one pushing the group to go farther than planned, and Lily was quieter but served as the emotional balance in the group. They had shared many previous trips together, from forests and mountains to deserts, and that familiarity made them believe this time would be no different. At first, the journey went smoothly as they followed the main tourist route, stopping to take photos and capture familiar moments. However, as they ventured deeper into the desert, Ryan suggested veering off the main path to explore an area few people knew about that he had seen on an old map. Ethan hesitated because the area was not on any official route, but he eventually agreed when the whole group was convinced by curiosity and the sense of adventure. The vehicle began to leave the familiar road, heading into a barren, rocky terrain with no signs, no vehicle tracks, and cell phone signals that started to flicker and then disappeared completely. It was here that Maya noticed something unusual. A strange structure sitting among the natural rock formations, partially buried under sand, with a surface that looked like metal or concrete, and completely out of place in the surrounding environment. She immediately raised her camera and took a series of shots, and the more she observed, the more she felt something was wrong. The group stopped and moved closer, but as they approached, the initial excitement quickly turned into an argument. Ethan thought they should turn back immediately because the area was unsafe and not recorded on any map. Ryan wanted to continue exploring because he believed they had just found something unknown. Lily began to worry as she realized they had completely lost signal, and Maya remained captivated by the structure in front of her, as if it hid something beneath. While the argument was still unresolved, one final text message was sent from Maya's phone to a friend, with brief but cryptic content. "We found something. It's not on any map." After that message, all communication was completely cut off. No calls, no texts, no location, as if they had vanished from every system. At first, the silence only made friends think they were in an area without service, but as hours turned into days, worry began to spread. Lily's family realized this was not normal because she always called home every evening. Ethan's father kept trying to reach him but received no response. Repeated calls from multiple sides all fell into silence. That prolonged silence quickly turned into fear as everyone realized this was unlike any of their previous trips. Finally, in a state of panic and the premonition that something serious had happened, the families of all 4 contacted local police to report them missing. Immediately after the missing persons report was received, local police coordinated with rescue forces to quickly launch a large-scale search operation in the Death Valley National Park area. known for its harsh conditions and difficult-to-access terrain. Response teams were mobilized in the shortest time, with helicopters patrolling overhead for wide-area scans, while ground forces were divided into small groups to check every rocky area, canyon, and rarely used trail. The first days of the operation were considered the golden time, when hope of finding traces of the 4 people remained high. But from the start, the search teams faced a harsh reality. The desert does not leave lasting traces. Hot winds and constantly shifting sand could erase any footprints within just a few hours, making it nearly impossible to track their direction of movement. Tracking dogs were brought in to follow scents from the area where the vehicle was believed to be their last stop, but the dogs quickly lost the trail and could not determine a clear direction, as if the scent had been abruptly cut off. After nearly a day of searching, the group's vehicle was discovered, positioned off the main tourist route, parked in a barren, rocky area with no signs of collision or damage. The vehicle's location was not in an area that regular vehicles typically visited, indicating they had deliberately left the main path to venture deeper into the wilderness. Upon approaching the vehicle, investigators noted that the doors were not forced, the windows were intact, and there were no signs of any struggle or attack having occurred there. Inside the vehicle, some personal items remained untouched, including clothing, water bottles, and everyday belongings, which made the theory that they had left in an emergency difficult to explain. Notably, Maya's camera was not in the vehicle, suggesting she had taken it with her when she left. There were no drag marks, no blood, no signs that they had been forced to leave, all of which created a puzzling picture. 4 people had vanished without leaving clear traces. As the search area expanded, the rescue teams faced increasingly harsh environmental conditions. Daytime temperatures could exceed what humans could endure for long periods, while nighttime temperatures dropped sharply, creating extreme changes. The rugged, rocky terrain, deep canyons, and areas without clear paths made movement dangerous even for trained personnel. Helicopters continued to scan large areas, looking for signs of humans such as fabric, reflective signals, or any unusual movement, but all yielded no results. The second day, then the third passed, and hope gradually turned into anxiety. Search teams began expanding farther from the vehicle's location, checking areas that might provide temporary shelter, but they found no signs that the group had ever been there. After many days of continuous searching, no new evidence was discovered, and investigators began to form the initial hypothesis that the group might have gotten lost in the desert's harsh conditions and been unable to return. This was not an uncommon scenario in the area, where even a small mistake could lead to serious consequences. However, what made the case unusual was the complete absence of any traces. After the official search operation ended without producing any specific results, the file on the 4 missing people gradually shifted to a familiar but haunting status in the investigation system. Missing, presumed dead. Missing and presumed deceased, even though there were no bodies, no direct evidence, and no clear answers about what had happened. For law enforcement, this was a procedural step based on probability and experience. Since the harsh conditions of the desert in Death Valley National Park had long been known as a factor capable of claiming the lives of anyone not properly prepared. However, for the families of Ethan, Maya, Ryan, and Lily, this conclusion was not only unconvincing but unacceptable. They repeatedly emphasized that no evidence confirming death had been found, and closing the case based on assumption was giving up too soon. In the months that followed, the victims' families began organizing their own search efforts, coordinating with friends, volunteers, and local residents familiar with the area's terrain. They returned to the spot where the vehicle was found, expanding the search in directions they believed might have been overlooked in the initial operation. Flyers were distributed, social media posts calling for information were circulated, and small groups repeatedly returned to the desert at different times in hopes that this time they would find something. But every trip ended the same way. No traces, no answers, only prolonged silence and the feeling that they were searching in an endless void. Meanwhile, the media began shifting attention to newer cases, and the story of the 4 missing friends gradually disappeared from the news. The articles that had appeared densely in the first weeks were now only in archives, and their names were no longer mentioned on television or news websites. Time passing not only reduced public attention, but also blurred the few initial clues, making the investigation more difficult than ever. No new evidence emerged, no witnesses came forward, and there was no signal indicating whether they were alive or dead. With each passing year, the chance of discovering the truth seemed increasingly remote, and the case gradually fell into silence. At the local level, the official file was closed, no longer prioritized for resources or personnel, and existed only as an unsolved case in a long list of missing persons. However, for the families, the matter had never truly ended. They continued to hold on to personal belongings, photos, and the final messages as a way to cling to hope. In private conversations, they still mentioned the possibility that the four had not simply gotten lost and died, but might have encountered something they did not fully understand. The lack of clear evidence did not make them give up. Instead, it reinforced their belief that there was still a part of the truth undiscovered, some detail that had been overlooked, and that this story could not end the way the official file had recorded. In 2023, nearly 7 years after the disappearance had gradually faded into obscurity, an amateur hiker on a personal exploration in a remote area of Death Valley National Park accidentally discovered an unusual object lodged between rock crevices and layers of sand compacted by hot winds. An old camera, its body scratched and covered in dust, but still intact enough to recognize that it was not a device left behind long ago under normal natural conditions. The discovery location was far from the area where search forces had focused in 2016. In a rugged and hard-to-access terrain that previous search groups could not fully cover due to time and environmental limitations. The discoverer initially thought it was a forgotten device, but upon quick inspection, he noticed the memory card was still inside, and instead of viewing the data himself, he brought the device to report it to local authorities. When the camera was transferred to the technical department for examination, specialists quickly realized that the data on the memory card was still readable, and the first images extracted immediately shocked the entire investigation team. The photos showed 4 familiar faces: Ethan, Maya, Ryan, and Lily, the people who had been declared missing years earlier. And what was astonishing was that they not only appeared in the photos, but were clearly still alive at the time the images were taken. However, their condition was unlike any images from their previous trips. Their bodies were emaciated, faces gaunt, eyes empty and completely lacking expression, as if they had endured a long period under extremely harsh conditions. Experts quickly noted signs that this was not exhaustion caused by the natural environment in a short time, but the result of a prolonged, controlled, and repeated process. One particularly striking detail was that on each person's body there appeared clearly carved numbers, located in different positions, but seemingly done according to a certain pattern, not in a normal sequence and not carrying simple personal identification meaning. These numbers did not resemble any symbols used in survival situations or ordinary self-marking, but had a systematic and intentional quality, as if each person had been assigned a code in some process. Upon deeper analysis of the photos, the technical team noticed that the lighting in the images did not have the characteristics of sunlight. No natural shadows, no changes according to the time of day, and the light color had a stable tone, suggesting they were taken in an enclosed space where the light was artificially created. The walls appearing in the background were also unlike the natural rocky terrain outside the desert, but had a rougher, flatter, and more uniform texture, resembling constructed or reinforced surfaces. These details quickly ruled out the possibility that the photos were taken outdoors or in a natural environment, and instead reinforced the hypothesis that the 4 had been held in an enclosed space, completely isolated from the outside world. When this information was reported to higher levels, the case was immediately reopened, this time with the involvement of federal investigative agencies, and the images from the camera were quickly shared with specialized units for deeper analysis. The technical examination process began with the goal of precisely determining the time, circumstances, and conditions under which they were taken, and what was discovered quickly changed the entire perception of this disappearance case. The metadata in the image files, although interrupted in some segments, was still sufficient for experts to reconstruct a relatively clear timeline, showing that the photos were not taken on the same day or in a short period, but span multiple different time points, separated by weeks or even months. Some images showed signs of system time editing, but when cross-referenced with other factors, such as wear on clothing, changes in the victim's physical condition, and the degree of physical decline shown in each frame, experts concluded that this sequence of images reflected a prolonged process, not a single event. This meant that the 4 had not disappeared in a short moment, but had existed somewhere for a long period unknown to anyone. Analysis of the shooting angles and composition of the photos continued to reinforce this hypothesis. In most frames, the camera was placed in a stable position with repeated viewpoints, nearly fixed height, and relatively consistent distance to the subjects. This did not resemble spontaneous photography by someone trying to record their own condition, but rather a deliberately repeated procedure. There were no signs that the person holding the camera was one of the 4 victims because in many photos, all 4 appeared together, standing or sitting in an almost identical composition, as if they had been positioned before the photo was taken. Experts determined that the photographer had full control over the situation, and taking photos might be part of a periodic procedure. What was even more notable was how the victims appeared in the photos. None of them looked directly at the lens. There was no reactive expression to the camera's presence, and there were no signs of communication with the photographer. Their eyes often looked down, to the side, or into empty space, with empty and unfocused expressions. This was not the normal reaction of a person standing in front of a camera, especially in the context that they might be held captive, but rather a sign of severe decline in social response and cognition. Some psychologists suggested that this state could occur when a person has been isolated for a long time, without social interaction, and with complete control over their living environment. The environment appearing in the photos also provided important information. The background behind the victims was not the natural desert landscape, but rough walls with uneven texture, with surfaces resembling unfinished concrete or reinforced stone. There were no signs of windows, openings, or any natural light sources. The light in the photos had a stable tone, unchanging with the time of day, and did not create the characteristic shadows of sunlight, indicating that the entire space was illuminated by an artificial light source. Some photos showed light coming from a fixed direction above or in front, with constant intensity, further reinforcing the hypothesis that this was a controlled and closed environment. The victim's clothing was also carefully analyzed. Although there were changes between photos, showing they were not wearing the same outfit throughout, all the clothing sets shared common features of being simple with few details, and showing clear signs of wear. There were no signs that they had the right to choose clothing. Instead, they seemed to be provided with a limited number of outfits and had to use them for a long time. The changes in physical condition between photos from clear emaciation, muscle atrophy, to changes in posture and ability to maintain balance, showed a prolonged decline, not the result of a few days or weeks of lack of food. One detail quickly became the focus of the entire analysis direction: the numbers carved on the victims' bodies, because they were not only visually haunting but also showed signs of a system maintained over a long time. Initial observations showed that these numbers did not overlap among the 4 people and did not follow any simple sequence like 1, 2, 3, or ordinary numbering forms. This difference led experts to rule out the possibility that this was a traditional personal identification marking. However, when the numbers were systematically cross-referenced with the timeline reconstructed from the photo's metadata, a pattern gradually emerged. The numbers tended to increase over time. Photos identified as taken earlier often came with lower numbers, while photos taken at later times showed markedly higher numbers. This increase was not always linear, but still showed a repeating cycle, as if each number represented a certain milestone in the controlled process. A particularly notable finding was that some numbers exceeded the 1,000 mark, which immediately changed the entire understanding of their nature. A simple marking system rarely required such large values unless it reflected a process extended over a very long time. Numbers exceeding 1,000 suggested that the marking had been ongoing for many years, which perfectly aligned with what was inferred from the victim's physical changes in the photo sequence. The existence of such large numbers also ruled out the possibility that these were random or temporary symbols, but instead part of a regularly maintained and controlled process. The next question raised was whether the victims could have performed the carving of these numbers themselves. Image analysis showed that the carvings had relatively uniform depth, clear lines, and were placed in consistent positions on the body, often in areas difficult to reach if a person were doing it themselves under weakened physical conditions. In addition, there were no signs that the carvings were made in a hasty or uncontrolled state. Instead, they showed precision and repetition, as if done with the same tool and fixed method. No images recorded the process of creating these marks, but the uniformity in shape and position indicated a high likelihood that they were performed by someone else, and that this occurred according to a certain procedure rather than random action. From there, the hypothesis of a marking system according to a control or observation cycle began to be reinforced. The numbers could correspond to the number of days each victim had been held, reflecting the passage of time in an environment where they had no way to recognize time themselves. Another explanation suggested that the numbers represented stages in a process, where each milestone marked a certain change in the victim's state or behavior. Regardless of the interpretation, the common point was the existence of an internal logic that the perpetrator followed consistently. The numbers were not merely physical traces, but evidence of the presence of a control system designed and operated over a long time, where every action had a purpose and was repeated in cycles. Another important approach implemented in parallel with image analysis and the number system was the examination of material traces appearing on the victim's clothing and bodies in the photos. Because although the surrounding environment did not provide direct information about the location, small details such as dust, residue, and mineral particles could still provide geographic clues. Geologists and forensic experts zoomed in on each area in the photos, especially the folds in clothing, wrists, knees, and footwear, where material particles tended to accumulate the most. Through high-resolution image analysis combined with comparison of sample data from different areas in Death Valley National Park, they determined that the dust on the victim's clothing was not ordinary desert sand, but contained specific mineral components, including crystalline silica particles, iron oxides, and some rare metal compounds that typically only appeared in areas with past mining activity. These types of minerals had structures and compositional ratios distinctly different from the sand and surface rock layers in popular tourist routes, which were mainly natural sediments weathered over a long time. This discovery immediately ruled out the possibility that the victims were simply held in a random location in the desert, and instead directed the investigation team's attention to areas with a history of industrial mining, where the geological structure had once been altered by humans. When the mineral data was cross-referenced with the area's geological maps, some matching points began to appear, concentrated in areas that had once been mines from many decades ago but had been abandoned and were no longer monitored. These areas were not in tourist zones and were often avoided due to risks of tunnel collapse or unstable terrain, which explained why they were not in the initial search scope. Experts continued to narrow the scope by ruling out mines that had been inspected or completely filled, focusing on areas where historical records showed the existence of tunnels that had not been fully surveyed. Archived records from land management and mineral extraction agencies showed that in the past, the area had dozens of small-scale mining sites, many operated by private companies or individuals, with manually dug tunnel systems and no detailed maps. After mining operations ended, many tunnels were left unsealed or incompletely recorded, creating a complex underground network that even authorities did not fully understand. Some old documents even mentioned that these tunnels could connect to each other or extend deeper than initially expected due to unplanned unified mining processes. This data raised the possibility that a large underground system might exist beneath the desert surface, where an individual with knowledge and time could exploit it to build or modify an enclosed space sufficient to hide activities for a long time without detection. The combination of specific mineral traces, geographic location removed from popular routes, and the existence of unmapped underground structures helped the investigation team significantly narrow the suspected area, shifting the focus from surface searching to concentrating on points likely to contain underground spaces. This also explained why previous search efforts, despite being large-scale and quickly deployed, still could not detect any traces of the four people. Because if they were truly held in an underground system outside direct observation, then all traditional surface trace-based search methods would become ineffective. Based on the geological analysis results that had narrowed the suspected area to some locations with old mining history in Death Valley National Park, the investigation team shifted to using modern surveillance technologies to inspect these positions without disturbing the surface. Thermal drones were deployed in batches, flying at sufficient altitude to scan the entire suspected area while recording real-time thermal data with high resolution. The goal was to detect points with abnormal temperature differences compared to the surrounding environment, because in desert conditions, surface temperatures usually change very quickly between day and night, and any stable heat source existing underground could create a different signature. In the first days of scanning, most of the collected data matched the natural characteristics of the area, where surface temperatures were directly affected by sunlight and rocky terrain, with no clear signs of human activity. However, as the scope was narrowed further and flights were conducted at different times of the day, especially at night when ambient temperatures dropped, an abnormal heat point began to appear in the data. This point was located under a thick layer of rock with no surface signs indicating human intervention, but it maintained a significantly higher stable temperature level than the surrounding area. What caught the experts' attention was not only the existence of this heat point, but also its stability over time. While the surrounding natural areas showed clear temperature fluctuations between day and night, this point remained almost unchanged, indicating that the heat source did not depend on sunlight, but originated from a system below. Experts ruled out the possibility that this was a natural geothermal phenomenon, because the area was not located on any recorded geological fault or underground heat source in previous geological maps. In addition, the shape of the heat region did not match natural phenomena, but had a linear and evenly distributed form, suggesting a structured space. When the data was analyzed more deeply, experts noticed that this heat region was not a single point, but spread in a certain direction, as if it connected with other spaces beneath the surface. This raised the hypothesis that an enclosed underground system might exist, where heat was maintained stably due to human activity, such as electrical systems, ventilation, or other equipment. To confirm this hypothesis, additional flights were conducted with higher resolution, focusing on the area with abnormal signs. The results show that the heat distribution was not random, but had a clear structure, with hot and cold regions alternating according to a certain pattern, similar to how heat spreads in enclosed spaces with multiple rooms or corridors. This further reinforced the conclusion that beneath that rock layer, there might exist an underground system designed and operated for a long time. Based on all the collected data, the investigation team concluded that this area had a high probability of containing an enclosed underground structure large enough to create a detectable temperature difference from the air. The next decision was no longer wide area searching, but concentrating all resources on one specific point where all signs converged. This area was quickly sealed discreetly to avoid attracting unnecessary attention, while ensuring no external interference could alter the current state. An approach plan was developed with the participation of specialized units, including technical teams, tactical teams, and safety experts, to ensure that entry into the suspected structure would be carried out in a controlled manner and with minimal risk. The precise identification of the abnormal heat point beneath the desert surface shifted the entire focus of the investigation from searching for traces to direct approach of a specific target, where all previously collected data from images and numbers carved on the victims' bodies to mineral traces converged, and the tactical team understood that they were no longer facing a hypothesis but a real space existing underground. In the dim light of dawn in Death Valley National Park, they moved to the marked position, where the surface looked completely natural, with stacked rock formations and no clear signs of human intervention if observed with the naked eye. However, previous data had indicated that the anomaly lay right below, and upon detailed inspection, small but consistent signs began to emerge. The joints between the rocks were not entirely random. Some surfaces had a flatness inconsistent with natural weathering, and the layer of dust on top seemed deliberately distributed to conceal the structure below. After removing the outermost rock layers, a thick metal surface gradually appeared, designed to blend completely with the surrounding environment, non-reflective, and not creating easily detectable signals from a distance. This structure was not just a simple door, but a multi-layered protective barrier with reinforced points and complex mechanical locking mechanisms, showing it was built to last long and resist both intrusion and detection. The technical team had to work carefully to cut through the metal layer without causing large vibrations that could affect the structure below, while the tactical team held positions and monitored for any unusual signals. When the final protective layer was removed, a pitch-black void opened below, along with a heavy, cold airflow carrying the characteristic musty smell of an enclosed space isolated for a long time. The reinforced stairs leading down were made of artificial materials, with even and sturdy steps, showing this was not a temporary entrance, but part of a fully designed system. As they went deeper, natural light completely disappeared, and the team had to rely entirely on flashlights. White light cutting through the dense darkness but unable to dispel the feeling of being surrounded by a cramped and unusually silent space. Sound in the tunnel was almost completely absorbed, each footstep echoing only for a very short distance before vanishing, creating a sense of spatial disorientation. The corridors connected in a purposeful structure, not random like in ordinary abandoned mines, but with clear divisions between areas, with narrow transition segments leading to larger spaces, then narrowing again, as if designed to control movement flow. Metal doors began to appear along the corridors, each without an external handle, only a small eye-level slot. And when the first door was opened, the space inside immediately revealed the true purpose of the entire system. The cells were so small that an adult could only crouch or lie on their side, with no items except the rough, cold floor and walls. There was no separate lighting, no signs of environmental change, only scratches and scattered carvings on the walls, traces of time and prolonged existence in a confined space. As subsequent rooms were opened, people began to appear in that darkness. Lily was recognized almost immediately, but the identification existed only in name. because the image before them had changed to the point where it was difficult to connect with the person she once was. Her body was so thin that her joints protruded, her skin lost color, her hair long and tangled, as if it had not been cared for in a long time. The light from the flashlight shining in did not create the reaction a normal person would have. There was no avoidance, no reflex to the light intensity, only prolonged immobility. When a name was called, the sound seemed to carry no meaning, with no change in expression or gaze direction, as if the connection between sound and identity had been severed. However, a reaction appeared with closer movement, especially the sound of footsteps. Her body immediately curled up, hands raised to cover her head. A strong, instinctive defensive reflex, showing she had become accustomed to associating that sound with danger. The others were also found in similar states, each in a separate space, with no interaction among them and no signs of recognizing the presence of others. A room deeper in the system revealed an individual not on the original list of 4 missing people, which immediately showed that the scope of this system was much larger than predicted. This person was also in a state of exhaustion, with signs indicating a prolonged period of captivity, lacking the ability to communicate and respond in normal ways. As the rescue team began to approach to bring the victims out, they quickly realized that rescue could not be carried out using standard methods. Any quick movement, strong light, or sudden sound could trigger extreme fear responses, causing the victims to withdraw, resist, or fall into a complete freeze state. Some did not respond when instructed to move, not because they could not, but because they did not understand the request, as if the concept of choice or autonomous action had been erased. The rescue team was forced to adjust their entire approach, reducing light intensity, keeping voices low and steady, moving slowly, and avoiding any actions that could be perceived as threats. Physical contact was carried out step by step, with distance gradually reduced to create a sense of safety, and in many cases, it took several minutes just to get a victim to accept the presence of another person in their space. One by one, they were brought out of the cells, through the corridors, and up the stairs to the outside. But even as natural light began to shine in, the reactions remained very limited. With no signs of recognizing the environmental change or the meaning of being taken out of that space, some turned their heads back multiple times, as if uncertain about leaving the place that had become their entire world for such a long time. The entire underground area at Death Valley National Park was quickly turned into a site for in-depth analysis, where the forensic and technical teams began to reconstruct a detailed diagram of the newly discovered system in order to understand clearly how it had been built and operated for such a long time without being detected. Laser scanning devices and 3D imaging technology were used to accurately record every corridor, every room, and every connection point, thereby creating a complete map of the entire underground space. Initial data showed that this structure was not a simple series of tunnels like those in ordinary abandoned mines, but was organized into multiple distinct layers, each with its own separate function and linked together in a purposeful order. The first layer was the entry zone, where access from the surface led down through a narrow reinforced staircase designed to limit visibility and force anyone descending to move in a single direction. This space served as a transition point where every element from light, temperature to sound began to change gradually, creating a clear separation between the outside and the inside. Next was the buffer zone, a larger intermediate space where experts discovered signs of a ventilation system hidden within the walls, allowing air to circulate without creating noise or clear signs on the surface. This buffer zone not only helped stabilize the environment, but also created an isolation layer, preventing direct exchange between the outside and the core area, while controlling movement flow before approaching more critical zones. The central core was the most complex part, where the holding cells and the network of corridors connecting them were concentrated. Here, the structure became dense, with many tunnel branches spreading out in different directions, forming a disorienting network without a detailed map. Some tunnels led to empty rooms or ended abruptly, while others connected deeper into the system, showing that this layout was not random but intended to control and restrict free movement. Experts noted that the distribution of corridors and rooms did not follow a simple symmetrical pattern, but was designed to cause confusion, making it easy for anyone unfamiliar with the structure to lose their sense of direction. As for materials, the walls of the entire system were not just natural rock, but had been reinforced with concrete, forming a combined layer of both materials that increased durability and stability. The concrete was not finished on the surface like in civilian constructions, but it was sufficient to create a solid reinforcement layer, showing that the construction process had been carried out with the goal of long-term use. The joints between rock and concrete were sealed tightly, leaving no large gaps, which not only enhanced structural integrity, but also helped limit the transmission of sound and light. The door system for the holding cells was one of the most notable elements. Each door was made of thick metal, with the locking mechanism located entirely on the outside, with no handles or any means of opening from the inside. The hinges were designed so they could not be removed from the inside, and the only opening was a narrow slot sufficient only for observation or passing in a small amount of items. This made escape nearly impossible without external intervention. The interior space had no windows or any openings for natural light at all, and all light sources came from an electrical system installed recessed in the walls or ceiling. Electrical wiring was arranged neatly in small grooves, concealed to prevent detection or tampering, and power supply points were evenly distributed, allowing stable lighting to be maintained in each area. The complete elimination of natural light not only served the purpose of concealment, but also created an environment where those inside could not determine time or direction. The depth of the bunker, combined with the surrounding layers of rock and concrete, created an almost absolute soundproof environment. Sound measurement tests showed that sound from inside could not transmit outward, even at high intensity, and sound from outside could not penetrate in, making the entire space completely isolated from the world above. Deeper analysis of how this underground system could maintain operations for many years without detection led the technical team to examine all factors related to energy, water, air, and food supply, because such an enclosed structure could not exist long-term without a stable self-sustaining mechanism. On the surface at Death Valley National Park, experts discovered some rock areas with unusual arrangements. When they removed this camouflage layer, they found solar panels placed flat and covered with dust and rock debris to blend with the surrounding environment. These panels were not installed in an easily recognizable way, like in conventional systems, but were dispersed into many small clusters, connected by wiring hidden discreetly, reducing the chance of detection from the air or via satellite imagery. The electrical wiring from the panels did not run exposed, but was threaded through natural rock crevices, taking advantage of the existing terrain to completely conceal the path of the power system. When tracing these wires, the technical team determined they were routed down to the bunker through small access points, where the wires were fed inside without creating any clear signs on the surface. The electrical system inside the bunker was distributed evenly to all areas, providing stable lighting and maintaining the operation of necessary equipment without signs of interruption. There was no evidence that this system depended on external power sources, which indicated that all energy was generated and used on-site. Regarding the water source, experts discovered many large tanks built recessed under the floor of some areas in the bunker. These tanks were solidly reinforced, with tight-fitting lids and connected to a piping system that distributed water to each usage area. The amount of water in the tanks was large enough to sustain operations for a long time without frequent replenishment. Some signs suggested water could be collected from natural sources such as rare rainwater or moisture in the air, then stored and used gradually. The placement of storage tanks in multiple different locations helped reduce the risk of interruption if one part of the system failed. Food was also an important factor analyzed. In the storage areas, the investigation team found a large quantity of dried and canned goods arranged in separate sections with clear categorization and easy access. These types of food had long shelf lives, did not require complex storage conditions, and were suitable for long-term storage. There were no signs of food being replenished regularly, such as new packaging or traces of recent supply deliveries, which indicated that the supply had been prepared in advance in sufficient quantities for use over many years. The arrangement of food also showed an organized system where distribution could be controlled and maintained regularly. The ventilation system was one of the most sophisticated elements. Experts discovered small ducts integrated into the walls and ceiling that brought air from outside into the interior, without creating noise or strong, easily recognizable air currents. The surface ends of the ducts were hidden in rock crevices or under layers of sand, making them nearly impossible to detect without knowing the exact location. This system allowed continuous air circulation, maintaining the necessary oxygen levels and removing exhaust without revealing the bunker's location. There were no signs of large ventilation equipment or industrial fans, which showed that the system was designed to operate silently and efficiently in an enclosed space. What the investigation team began to realize as they delved deeper into analyzing the environment inside the bunker was not limited to the physical structure or life support systems, but directly related to how this space affected the perception of those held captive, especially their sense of time. Throughout the entire underground system beneath Death Valley National Park, there existed no device that could help the victims determine time in the usual way. No clocks, no calendars, no natural light, no signs indicating the change between day and night. The only light in the bunker came from the electrical system that was completely controlled from the outside. And through analysis of power consumption data along with indirect evidence from the scene, experts noted that the lighting was not maintained on a stable cycle. Instead of turning on during the day and off at night like a natural simulation, this system appeared to be operated on an irregular cycle, sometimes maintaining continuous light for long periods, sometimes turning off completely for undetermined intervals. This inconsistency made any effort by the victims to determine time meaningless because they could not rely on light to distinguish day from night, nor could they rely on their natural biological rhythms when the surrounding environment provided no suitable cues. The holding space inside the bunker was also designed to completely eliminate any elements that could create change over time. The temperature in the holding cells remained almost unchanged, maintained at a stable level thanks to the depth of the structure and the sealed ventilation system, with no fluctuations like on the surface where temperatures could change markedly between day and night. Sound was also almost completely suppressed, with no wind noise, no sounds from the outside environment, and no sound changes over time as in a natural setting. This created a feeling of absolute silence, where everything seemed frozen, with no beginning and no end. In such an environment, the concept of time gradually became vague and eventually disappeared entirely from human perception. Psychological experts determined that when a person is placed in a space without any time cues for a long period, the brain gradually loses the ability to maintain a stable biological rhythm, leading to sleep disturbances, reduced cognitive ability, and ultimately complete disorientation regarding time. These signs matched the state the victims displayed when found: no reaction to changes in light, no expressions indicating they recognized the time, and no ability to determine how long they had been there. The inability to distinguish day, week, or month was not only a cognitive issue but also led to severe psychological collapse. When time could no longer be perceived, every experience became continuous and without separation points, making memories impossible to organize in sequence, and the sense of self gradually faded. In that state, victims lost the ability to orient themselves, could not plan or predict what would happen next, and gradually lost any sense of control over their own lives. Another important factor identified was the appearance of the perpetrator in this environment. When all natural cues were removed, the appearance of another human became the only element that could create change, and over time, victims began to depend entirely on those appearances to define reality. If the perpetrator appeared to provide food, turn lights on or off, or perform any action, those events became the only milestones for the victims to measure the passage of time, even if inaccurately. This created a distorted connection, where the perpetrator not only controlled the physical environment, but also completely controlled how the victims perceived the world around them. The space inside the holding cells, when measured and recorded in detail, showed a consistent and purposeful design aimed at restricting the movement of those held to the maximum extent. Each room was only large enough for an adult to crouch or lie on their side, with the ceiling height so low that they could not stand fully upright, forcing the body to maintain a bent posture for long periods. This size not only caused physical discomfort, but also increased the feeling of being trapped, with no space to stretch or move freely. The wall surfaces were rough, cold, and unfinished, yet they bore numerous carved marks of varying depths and shapes, extending in many directions and at different heights. Experts determined that these marks were made with small hard objects, possibly pieces of metal or stone, and were created over a long time with a clear purpose to count time. However, what was notable was that the carved marks did not form continuous and clear sequences like the way an ordinary person would mark days and months, but were often interrupted, misaligned, or overlapping one another. In some places, old marks were crossed by new ones, creating a complex layer of traces, showing that more than one person had tried to use the wall to record time. This overlapping was evidence that multiple victims had been held in the same space, each continuing or replacing the marks of the previous one. But there was no way to maintain an accurate time-counting system when the surrounding environment provided no stable cues. This aligned with what had been determined about the loss of time perception when victims tried to create their own system but gradually lost the ability to maintain it. The space inside the room showed no signs of personal belongings at all. There were no spare clothes, no daily items, nothing that could be used to create a sense of familiarity or personalize the space. Everything had been reduced to the bare minimum, leaving only the floor and wall surfaces, creating an environment where personal identity had no place to exist. The absence of personal items was not only material deprivation, but also an important psychological factor, because it left those held without any anchor to maintain a sense of self. The floors of the holding cells also showed signs of prolonged use, with clearly worn areas, especially in positions where the human body frequently made contact, such as corners of the room where they could sit or lie. These marks were uneven, showing shifts in position over time, but still concentrated in certain fixed points, reflecting habits restricted within the small space. Walls in some areas showed more scratching, possibly from victims trying to expand the space or create change in their surroundings. When comparing different rooms, the investigation team noted a clear similarity in design and level of wear, showing that the entire system had been built according to a uniform pattern and had been used repeatedly, many times. Some rooms showed signs of longer use, with thicker layers of dust and deeper wear, while others showed newer signs, but still without any indication that they had only been used for a short time. This reinforced the conclusion that this system was not created for a single event, but had been operating for a long time, with different victims held there in different phases. Direct observations from the rescue team and psychological experts at the scene showed a level of damage far beyond what could be explained by material deprivation alone, as the victims were not only physically exhausted but also displayed a psychological state that was almost completely detached from reality. They did not communicate, did not respond to speech, and showed no signs that they were aware of the presence of those trying to help them. When called by name, most showed no response, did not turn their heads, did not change expression, as if sound no longer carried any meaning connected to personal identity. In some cases, there was a very slow reaction, but it was not recognition, but rather a vague, undirected reflex without clear purpose. This showed that the ability to process social information had been severely impaired, to the point where basic stimuli such as voices or the presence of other people were no longer correctly identified. In addition to the lack of communication, the victims displayed prolonged repetitive behaviors, often simple movements such as rocking the body back and forth, holding the same posture for long periods, or repeatedly performing a small action without any clear purpose. These behaviors did not change according to circumstances, did not respond to the surrounding environment, and seemed to have become a fixed part of how they existed. Experts determined that this was a manifestation of the brain trying to create its own stimulation in an environment completely lacking external stimuli, a self-protective mechanism when a person is placed in prolonged isolation. When there was a sudden noise, especially footsteps or nearby sounds, their reaction was not curiosity or attention, but a strong defensive reflex. The body curled up, hands raised to cover the head or face, similar to an animal's reaction when sensing danger. This reflex appeared almost immediately without going through a cognitive processing stage, showing it had been reinforced over time as an instinctive response. What was notable was that this reaction did not distinguish between familiar or unfamiliar people, between those trying to help or those who might cause harm. All were treated as potential threats. This loss of the ability to differentiate reflected a profound level of trauma in how the brain assessed the surrounding environment. Some victims not only lost the ability to communicate, but also showed no signs of self-recognition, with no reaction when looking in a mirror or when called by name, as if the concept of I had been erased. They showed no awareness of their own body as a separate entity and had no response when addressed or approached in a personalized way. This showed that personal identity no longer existed as part of their perception, but had been replaced by a passive state of existence, where all behavior was reflexive rather than active. When experts tried to re-establish basic communication, they found that even simple signals, such as eye contact, gestures, or soft sounds, were not enough to create connection, and any effort beyond that could trigger negative reactions. The complete absence of social responses combined with repetitive behavior and defensive reflexes created a clear picture that the victims had been placed in an environment that not only controlled their bodies, but also gradually eroded layer after layer of psychological function. The holding space provided no opportunity to maintain or develop social skills, with no interaction, no change, and no elements to reinforce a sense of self. Over time, this led to the degeneration of higher cognitive functions, causing people to revert to the most basic reactions in order to survive. What remained was not an individual with memories, emotions, and the ability to choose, but a state of existence limited to reflexes and habits. Experts agreed that this level of damage could not occur in a short time, but was the result of a prolonged process, where every environmental factor contributed to weakening and ultimately completely breaking down the structure of personality. The removal of natural light, control of time, restriction of space, deprivation of personal items, and severance of all forms of communication had created a system where humans no longer had the ability to maintain their own identity and were gradually transformed into entities that existed only in the present, with no past and no ability to imagine the future. The numbers appearing on the victims' bodies, which had already been noted from the initial image analysis phase, were now placed in a completely different context when the investigation team could directly cross-reference them with the scene and physical evidence collected inside the underground system. Upon thorough examination of each victim, experts noted that these numbers were not carved randomly, but appeared in nearly fixed positions on the body, with relatively uniform spacing and arrangement between individuals. This showed that the marking had been carried out according to a repeated procedure that may have been standardized in advance, rather than being impulsive behavior. The carvings had similar depths, clear lines, and no signs of hesitation, suggesting that the person performing them was accustomed to the operation and had carried it out many times under controlled conditions. There were no other symbols besides the numbers, no letters, no names, no personal identification marks, which led experts to conclude that using numbers instead of names was not only a marking method, but also a way to completely eliminate personal identity. When a human was no longer called by name, but only by a number, the connection between them and their own identity was gradually erased, replaced instead by a mechanical classification system. Another notable detail was the appearance of matching numbers among different victims. At first, this could cause confusion, but when placed in the broader context of the system, it showed the possibility of a form of classification by phase or state. Rather than each person having a unique number, the numbers could represent a certain level in the process they were undergoing, and the overlaps reflected that many people had reached the same stage at different times. When the investigation team expanded the search inside the bunker, they discovered some record boards stored in separate, not easily accessible areas, as if hidden but still kept for use. These boards were not ordinary journals, but resembled tracking sheets, where each line corresponded to a numbered individual, accompanied by symbols or check marks in cycles. Although there was no direct explanation of the meaning of each symbol, the repetition of recording patterns showed this was a regularly maintained tracking system. The check marks appeared at certain intervals, possibly corresponding to time, behavior, or some criterion the perpetrator used for evaluation. Some lines had more marks, some fewer, and this difference could reflect the level of compliance or response of each victim during the period of captivity. The existence of such a recording system showed that the perpetrator not only held captives, but also monitored and recorded changes in each individual over time, like a controlled process. When combining data from the record boards with the numbers on the victims' bodies, experts noted a certain correlation, although the exact meaning of each number could not yet be determined. One hypothesis raised was that the numbers could relate to the number of days held, but the overlaps among victims made this hypothesis not entirely convincing. Another direction of analysis suggested that the numbers represented stages in a cycle, where each stage corresponded to a certain level of control or psychological state. In that case, some victims having the same number could indicate they were at the same stage in that process. Another possibility was that the numbers reflected the level of compliance, where each number represented a degree of response or adaptation to the holding environment, and the change in numbers over time reflected the victim's progress or decline within that system. Although there was no final conclusion on the specific meaning, all analyses indicated that these numbers were not random, but part of a control system designed and operated in a structured way. The data collected from the overall structure, traces in the holding cells, and the numbers system began to lead to a more serious conclusion about the true scale of the entire underground system beneath Death Valley National Park. As the investigation team realized that the number of victims rescued accounted for only a small portion of the bunker's capacity, during the detailed mapping process, many holding cells were found empty but not unused. These rooms showed similar wear to those with victims, with scratches on the walls, scattered carvings, and floor surfaces worn over time. However, unlike the occupied rooms, these spaces showed no signs of recent presence, with thicker layers of dust and partially faded older marks, indicating they had not been used for a certain period. The existence of empty rooms with clear signs of use was an important indicator because it showed that the number of victims once held here was significantly greater than those found. When comparing the level of wear between rooms, experts noted differences in usage time, with some rooms showing very old signs while others showed newer ones, suggesting that this system had been used across multiple phases, with different victims brought in and removed over time. Some traces in the empty rooms suggested that people may have died in the system previously. In a few locations, forensic experts discovered stains on the floor and walls with characteristics matching biological traces that had decomposed over time. Although there was not enough material left to determine the exact origin, these areas were often in rude corners or near walls, where a body could have remained stationary for a long time before being moved or handled in some way. There were no signs of burial or body disposal inside the bunker itself, which raised questions about where those individuals had been taken and how it had been done without leaving clear traces. The complete absence of official records about other victims further increased the severity of this discovery. There were no previous missing persons reports directly linked to this location, no victim list matching the number of holding cells identified, which suggested that many disappearance cases may have occurred without being connected to one another or ever being detected. In that context, the bunker was no longer viewed as the holding site of a specific case, but had become a central point in a prolonged chain of events where many individuals had been brought in, held for long periods, and then disappeared without leaving traces in the legal system or media. The physical scale of the bunker also reinforced this conclusion. With the number of holding cells, corridors, and auxiliary areas recorded, this system had the capacity to hold many people at once, not just a few individuals. The layout of separate rooms, the ventilation system, and independent supplies allowed each person to be kept in an isolated space without affecting others, while maintaining the operation of the entire system for a long time. This showed that the goal was not to hold a small group for a short time, but to maintain an environment capable of receiving and controlling many victims across different phases. The combination of used rooms, traces indicating deaths had occurred, the absence of official records, and the large capacity of the structure formed a clear picture of the true scale of this system. The reconstruction of the entire bunker structure, along with its auxiliary systems, provided a large enough amount of data for the investigation team to shift to a more personalized direction of analysis, focusing on the question of who could have built and operated such a complex system for a long time without being detected. The technical features of the bunker showed that this was not a project that could be created by someone lacking expertise. The way the tunnels were laid out, the stability of the structure, the combination of natural rock and concrete, as well as the way the terrain was utilized to conceal the entire system, all reflected a deep understanding of mining and underground construction. It was not limited to just digging tunnels. The designer also had to know how to reinforce them to prevent collapse, how to distribute space to maintain air circulation, and how to control depth and position to ensure it would not be detected from the outside. These factors went far beyond the capabilities of an ordinary individual and pointed towards someone with a professional background in mining or underground structural engineering. From that assessment, the investigation team began reviewing the historical records of the area within Death Valley National Park, focusing on individuals who had worked in the mining industry or had been involved in tunneling activities in the past. The records showed that over many previous decades, the area had seen the presence of many small-scale mining groups, including both companies and independent individuals, with manually dug mine systems that were not always fully documented. From this list, investigators narrowed the scope to those with actual experience with the specific terrain of the area, while also having the ability to operate independently without drawing attention. Some names were placed under consideration, but most had clear histories, maintained contact with the community, or showed no signs of disappearing for long periods. However, one case began to stand out more when the data was cross-referenced more deeply. It was a mining engineer who had worked in the area many years earlier, whose professional background matched what was observed in the bunker. This person had participated in small mining projects, had experience with tunnel design and reinforcement, and more importantly, had disappeared from the community without a clear explanation many years before. There were no records of relocation elsewhere, no signs of involvement in public activities, and no updated information in official databases, which made this case more noteworthy than the others. Upon further checking, the investigation team noted that the time this person disappeared relatively coincided with the period when the bunker was believed to have begun construction, based on the level of wear and material traces inside. In addition, this person's experience was not limited to mining, but also included knowledge of structures and geology, allowing them to understand how to utilize the terrain to hide an underground structure without significantly altering the surface. Access to the area was also an important factor, because not everyone could move and work in such a harsh environment without being detected. With previous work experience, this person could have been familiar with little-used access routes and known how to avoid popular paths. When combining all the factors: specialized knowledge, practical experience, disappearance from the community, and ability to access the terrain, the investigation team concluded that this individual had a significantly higher level of suspicion compared to other subjects on the list. There was no direct evidence at that time to confirm this person's role in building or operating the bunker, but the degree of fit between the personal profile and the technical features of the system was too clear to ignore, and from there, the investigation direction began to focus on determining the location, activities, and any remaining traces that could link this person to the entire newly discovered underground structure. Information about the presence of an individual moving inside the tunnel system immediately turned the entire area beneath Death Valley National Park into an active pursuit space, where the tactical team was no longer just surveying but had to conduct a manhunt in complex and dangerous terrain conditions. Teams were deployed in multiple different directions based on the previously constructed 3D map, but they quickly realized that the deeper parts of the system had never been fully explored and contained many unpredictable variables. Heat signals and small vibrations continuously appeared and then disappeared on monitoring equipment, showing that the suspect was moving quickly and able to change direction constantly. Making full use of the complexity of the tunnels, the connecting corridors with nearly identical shapes made orientation difficult, forcing the forces to rely completely on equipment and manual marking to avoid getting lost. Some tunnel sections were suddenly blocked by rock masses and reinforced materials, but close inspection showed these were not natural collapses but deliberate arrangements, with obstacles placed in strategic positions to slow down the pursuit or force the team to redirect to other branches. In some areas, the tunnel ceiling showed signs of weakening, with fresh cracks and rock debris, indicating possible intervention to create the risk of collapse at any time, turning the environment itself into an obstacle. The space gradually shifted to complete darkness when moving away from areas with the electrical system, with the only light coming from night vision devices and infrared lights, creating limited visibility and requiring every movement to be carefully calculated. Sound in the tunnels remained strongly suppressed, but sometimes very faint noises appeared, light rolling of stones. Distant impacts, not enough to pinpoint the exact location, but sufficient to confirm the suspect was ahead and not standing still. The intersections appeared densely, with many sections branching into 3 or 4 directions, making the choice of path a high-risk decision, because choosing wrong could significantly widen the distance between the two sides. Some corridors were so narrow they allowed only one person to move at a time, forcing the team to proceed in single file and reducing the ability to react quickly in case of direct confrontation. Other sections suddenly opened into larger spaces, but this expansion itself created more escape routes, making control difficult. Data from tracking equipment showed the distance between the pursuing forces and the suspect was gradually narrowing, but not in a straight line, but through multiple direction changes, as if the person ahead knew every nook and cranny of the system and was leading the pursuit in a way that benefited them. Some signals disappeared completely for a few seconds and then reappeared in a different position, suggesting the possible existence of side passages or connecting sections not recorded in the initial map. This forced the tactical team to continuously update data, adjust movement direction, and maintain tight communication to avoid being separated. The prolonged pursuit pressure in the tunnel network finally led to a convergence point, where the movement signals were no longer scattered but concentrated in a narrow area deep within the structure, identified as a dead-end section with no clear exit on the map. The tactical team tightened the encirclement from multiple directions, advancing with a tightly controlled formation, step by step narrowing the distance in the dark and almost absolute silence deep beneath Death Valley National Park. When the light shone into the final area of the corridor, a human figure appeared, standing still in the illuminated area, not moving, not trying to hide, and showing no signs of panic or attempts to escape. The confrontation unfolded in a way completely opposite to what the forces had predicted. There was no resistance, no weapon drawn, no sudden movements, only the quiet presence of an individual facing the pursuit team directly. When the distance was shortened to the point where communication was possible, team members began issuing standard commands requiring the suspect to stay in place, raise hands, and not perform any actions. The response received was not hesitation or defiance, but near immediate compliance, yet the manner of compliance carried an unusual tone. The movements were slow, precise, and without signs of tension, as if this person did not perceive the danger of the situation they were facing. When ordered to lie down, he complied mechanically, without resistance, without hesitation, without the expression of someone cornered and losing control. This calmness was not ordinary acceptance, but carried a detached quality, as if the entire matter was not directly related to him. As they approached closer, the tactical team noticed that the suspect's eyes did not show fear or tension, but instead maintained a stable state, almost empty, yet still focused. There were no signs of attempting to assess the situation to find an escape. No typical physiological reactions such as trembling or changes in breathing. Everything remained under complete control. When verbal communication began, the first answers further reinforced the feeling that this was not a normal response. The voice was even, neither high nor low, without emotional variation, and the content of the answers did not show any acknowledgement of having committed wrongdoing. When asked about what had happened in the tunnel system, he neither denied nor made ordinary excuses, but described his actions as a purposeful process without using negative words or admitting fault. There were no signs of remorse, no expressions of anxiety about consequences, and no efforts to minimize responsibility. This made team members realize they were facing a deeply distorted psychological state, where the boundary between right and wrong behavior was no longer perceived in the usual way. As questioning continued, the suspect showed consistency in his perspective, viewing what he had done as a system with rules, logic, and objectives, rather than a series of random behaviors. The expression was not defensive, but similar to presenting a procedure, without hesitation or internal contradictions. The confrontation moment ended in unusual silence and quickly transitioned into a phase of complete scene control, when the suspect was subdued and brought out of the system without any conflict occurring, an outcome almost contrary to the complexity and danger of the underground environment beneath Death Valley National Park. Immediately afterward, the focus shifted from pursuit to fully exploiting the remaining structure, especially areas that had never been accessed during the rescue and manhunt. The forensic and technical teams conducted expanded examinations layer by layer, using the constructed 3D map as a base, while simultaneously checking the field to detect deviations or unrecorded extensions. The deeper they went, the more they realized that what had been discovered before was only part of a larger system. In the farther tunnel branches, some sealed rooms were found with signs of purposeful storage, where documents were placed in sealed metal boxes, protected from moisture and dust in a way that showed they were kept for long-term use rather than abandoned. When opening these boxes, the investigation team found many notebooks arranged in clear order, each corresponding to a time period or a specific group of individuals, with a consistent and repeating presentation structure. The pages were filled with symbols, numbers, and cyclical check marks that matched the numbers system observed on the victims' bodies, creating a direct link between the recorded data and the actual captivity. The content did not carry emotional or personal descriptions, but resembled a tracking sheet where each individual was recorded as a data unit, with variables changing over time. Some pages showed continuous marking cycles without interruption, reflecting a systematic and long-term monitoring process. Older documents showed signs of fading, yellowed paper, and some blurred symbols, but were still sufficient to determine that this system had been operating for many years earlier, far exceeding the period when the current victims had gone missing. This expanded the scope of the case, showing that this was not a recent series of events but a process maintained through multiple phases. As the examination continued, the investigation team discovered additional completely unused areas, new holding cells with complete structures but without any signs of wear. The walls were clean, without carvings, the floors had no wear marks, and there were no signs that humans had ever been there. These spaces were built to the same standards as the used rooms, from size, materials to the door and lock systems, showing they were not random additions, but part of an overall plan. The existence of these unused rooms showed that the system was not only designed to meet current needs, but also had the potential for future expansion, as if holding additional victims had been accounted for in advance. Some tunnel sections leading to these areas still showed signs of incomplete construction, with materials and tools left behind, indicating that the expansion process may have been interrupted by some factor, possibly time, resources, or external events. When cross-referencing all the data notebooks, physical structure, used and unused rooms, the investigation team realized that the entire bunker system was not a static space, but a structure that had developed over time, with phases of expansion and adjustment. There were no signs of haste or inconsistency in the construction. Everything was carried out according to a clear logic, from space division to data storage methods. This showed that the designer not only had technical knowledge, but also a long-term plan, where each part of the system served a specific purpose and could be expanded when necessary. The combination of self-sustaining capability, detailed recording systems, and unused reserve areas created a picture of an environment built to exist long-term, independent of external conditions, and capable of continuing operation if not detected. The interrogation process after the suspect was detained quickly shifted from confirming identity to extracting the motive and operational methods of the entire system. And what was recorded in the questioning sessions gradually outlined a completely distorted view of humans and the value of life. Throughout many prolonged interrogation sessions, the suspect did not deny building and maintaining the bunker, nor did he try to evade his central role. But the way he presented it carried no signs of awareness of guilt. The language used was technical, cold, and consistent, in which the victims were always referred to by terms such as units, subjects, or entities, with absolutely no personal names or any elements evoking personal identity. When asked directly about holding people in prolonged and harsh conditions, he did not respond with defense or excuses but described it as part of an operating system that he believed was rational and necessary. According to his statement, he did not view those held as full humans, but only as entities that could be observed and controlled in an environment completely isolated from external factors. This viewpoint was not an outburst, but appeared repeatedly, with the same argumentative structure, showing it was a belief formed and reinforced over a long time. When asked to explain the numbers system, the suspect described it as a tracking and classification tool where each number represented a state or phase in the process that the subjects underwent. He emphasized that the numbers did not carry personal meaning, but were only a way to record data, similar to marking in a research system. The notebooks found in the bunker were confirmed to have been established and maintained by him, with clear update cycles reflecting a continuous monitoring process. When investigators cross-referenced these records with the actual condition of the victims, the similarity between the data and the current state showed that the system not only existed in theory, but had been applied consistently over many years. A notable point in the statement was the complete absence of financial motives or personal grudges. There was no evidence that the suspect sought material benefits from his actions, nor any signs that the victims had been selected based on personal relationships or prior conflicts. When asked why he carried out these actions, he did not give a specific answer in the usual way, but only repeated that it was a procedure and necessary for observation. The absence of traditional motives led psychological experts participating in the interrogation to determine that this was a case of profound perceptual distortion, where behavior was not driven by emotion, but by a tightly organized but misguided belief system. When the case was brought to trial, all evidence collected from the bunker scene, including the physical structure, energy system, holding cells, wall traces, notebooks, and the condition of the victims was presented in court as a logically linked chain of data, proving that the behavior was not impulsive but planned and carried out systematically over a long time. Structural and geological experts analyzed how the bunker was built, pointing out that this was a project requiring high specialized knowledge and a prolonged implementation period that could not have been done randomly. Psychological experts presented the impact of the holding environment on human perception, explaining how controlling light, time, space, and communication had led to severe decline in the victim's personality and cognitive abilities. The statements of those rescued, although limited due to their psychological state, still provided details consistent with the physical data, further reinforcing the consistency of the entire case. Throughout the trial, the suspect maintained a calm attitude similar to that in the interrogation sessions, with no signs of anxiety or remorse, and did not change his view of his own behavior. This led the jury and participating experts to conclude that this was not only a serious criminal act, but also the manifestation of a distorted perceptual system maintained over a long time without adjustment. The court concluded that the suspect's behavior was intentional, carefully planned, and continuously carried out over many years, with a high level of control over the environment and the victims. Factors such as building the bunker, establishing the self-sustaining system, developing the numbers classification method, and maintaining detailed records were viewed as clear evidence that this was a system designed and operated with purpose, not a single action. What remained after the trial and the sentence was not a feeling of complete closure, but a prolonged void where the survivors and their families had to face an irreversible reality, a reality where answers did not mean liberation. Lily and the other victims, although brought out of the underground system beneath Death Valley National Park, could not return to the psychological state they had before disappearing. What they carried with them was not only memories, but also the way their brains had been restructured over many years of isolation and control. Psychological experts noted that the recovery process did not occur in a straight line but was interrupted by unpredictable reactions when seemingly normal stimuli such as sunlight, traffic noise, or the presence of many people at once became sources of stress. Some could not maintain eye contact for more than a few seconds, their gaze often avoiding or stopping at a fixed point, as if maintaining direct connection with others was too heavy a burden. Language, for them, was no longer a natural communication tool but became a process requiring effort, with many short, fragmented answers lacking connection and in many cases, no response at all. Repetitive behavior still appeared clearly, such as rocking the body, touching the same spot repeatedly, or holding the same posture for long periods, as if the body was still trying to recreate a familiar state from the old environment. When brought into open spaces without clear boundaries like the previous holding rooms, some victims showed disorientation, not knowing where to stand, how to move, or how to react. As if freedom was no longer an easily acceptable state, their families, who had lived for many years with hope mixed with despair, finally received answers about the fate of their loved ones. But that answer did not bring complete relief, because what they received back was not the person they had known before, but a version deeply changed. The reunions did not occur in the way they had imagined during the years of waiting. There were no immediate moments of recognition, no explosion of emotion, but instead hesitation, distance, and in some cases a lack of recognition. There were moments when a mother called her child's name and received no response, or when a friend stood before someone once close but could not re-establish connection. This created another form of loss. Not the loss of presence, but the loss of the person as they once knew them. The families had to learn to accept that the recovery process would be long, possibly many years, and might never be complete. Meanwhile, for the investigators, the case did not end when the sentence was pronounced, but opened up a series of new questions. Questions that were not easy to answer and not easy to ignore. The fact that a system like the bunker could be built, operated, and expanded for many years without being detected raised a profound issue about the limits of surveillance and awareness. The identified factors, remote terrain, underground structure, self-sustaining capability, and sophisticated concealment, were not the only conditions that existed in the real world. That led to a disturbing assumption that if such a system could exist for a long time unnoticed, then the possibility of similar systems existing elsewhere could not be ruled out. Authorities began reviewing unsolved missing persons cases again, looking for similarities that might have been overlooked before. But the dispersion of data and lack of connections between cases made the process complex. No clear pattern was confirmed, but that very lack of clarity increased the feeling of unease. This story, although it had a legal ending, still left a lingering echo, not only for those directly involved, but also for those who followed the case. What was frightening was not only the actions of one individual, but the fact that the entire system had existed for a long time without being detected. Right in an environment where humans believed they could understand and control, the layers of rock and sand had hidden not only a physical space, but also a parallel reality, where ordinary rules no longer applied. When the final light was shone in and the truth was exposed, what remained was not only the horror of what had happened, but also the awareness that the world still has gaps, places where control does not exist, and in those gaps, similar things may have, are, or will happen without anyone knowing. If you want to continue following unsolved cases and stories that make us question what exists beyond our sight, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out. Thank you for accompanying us to the end of the story, and see you in the next video.